What if your child has a diagnosis, and I'm talking a clinical diagnosis from a doctor, a psychologist, diagnosed with autism, but the school will not acknowledge or recognize the diagnosis? What do you do in that situation? Well, number one, it really doesn't matter if your child already qualifies for an IEP under one of the other 13 or one of the other 12 categories for the states that use the 13 federally recognized and don't have any additional ones. Then at that point, guys, I'm not going to say it really doesn't matter, because it does, and I'll explain why. But at the same time, having your foot in the door with regards to, having an IEP is going to be 90% of it. The autism diagnosis, when it comes to IEP planning, can be important. At the same time, the IEP team has a duty, once your child is found eligible, to consider any and all need, when it comes to that analysis that needs to be done on their diagnostic realities and how they manifest across the school setting and across their educational performance areas of academic, social, emotional development, communication, and functional independent living skills. So that's the Andrew F. analysis in order for your child to receive a FAPE. So the category for which they qualify is not as important because you don't have to re-qualify. And there's a lot of schools that get this wrong. They'll misapply the standard for related services, for example, to where they say, well, the child didn't meet the score or the cutoff to receive speech language services. And my thing is, there is no cutoff. Once your child has an IEP, the analysis for related service is different. Okay, they're not trying to be eligible for a speech language impairment. They already have an IEP under a different category. A related service is different. That relates over to benefit the child's main areas, that analysis I talked about, and why it would justify the need for speech language services. That's just one of them. I mean, there's a whole litany of things to where schools misapply the directions, the procedures, and the standards, and do so very confidently. And that's why a lot of parents are like, that's not what I was told. Well, you were told something wrong. And that includes, not being eligible for, let's say, autism-specific, peer-reviewed and scientifically proven approaches. That's nonsense. If your child is eligible under any other category, then the analysis of need for the child is based upon their diagnostic realities. And the diagnosis supersedes the category at that point, okay? So, but at the same time, does it happen? Yes, it happens frequently, because one of the categories, it could be any of those minimal requirements that each individual state does have. Most of the snafus, if I can call them that without getting in trouble, most of the snafus when it comes to why kids aren't being identified eligible under autism is because it's heavily reliant on behavior rating scales, for example. And a lot of parents medicate their children, and that includes ADHD and emotional disability, to the point where they are dependent upon rating scales filled out by teachers. And if the teachers have not seen the medicated child, they've only seen the medicated child and not the unmedicated child, then you see where there's a potential issue to where they're not seeing the problem. And of course that starts a big fight, because the parents are like, oh, this is how she or he acts at home, but they're not doing that at school because they're medicated. So that does cause a problem when it comes to eligibility for an IEP, or even a reeval or in a continued eligibility situation. So keep that in mind. But if they're eligible under any of the other categories, let's say specific learning disability, then okay, that's fine. And then you can sort of sort the autism thing out later. But this is where we have a clinical diagnosis of autism, and then the federal IDEA or your state requirement for being eligible under the category of autism, and they are not the same thing, okay? Because you do need a clinical diagnosis of autism in order to qualify under the category of autism. But the category of autism under the IDEA is slightly different because there's other things that must be met. There's a structured, unstructured observation. There's going to be those rating scales. And so that is where the confusion is. A clinical diagnosis or a medical diagnosis of autism and the category and the requirements within that category of qualifying for autism under the educational standard. And I know that people go, well, that's ridiculous, James. It is, but I didn't write the book. Okay, but I'm telling you, the good news is that it doesn't, if your child has an IEP, it does not mean that you don't do the analysis that I just talked about. And we don't consider and push for the IEP team to recognize the diagnostic realities of the child. And this is where you need good documentation in order to start presenting that argument. And teach your teams. Most of them are not trained on the new InjuryOS standard and this analysis of educational performance and impact across their education setting. But it's got to be a negative impact across their educational performance areas where we develop goals, services, supports, and accommodations, okay? Academics, social emotional development, communication, and functional independent living skills. And then transition when they get older and they become of age for transition services. Now you know.